The first one is open source business practices. And as you can see here, the things that you're going to learn in this program. So basically, we're learning about open source software. That's really what bullet point number 1 is about. Number 2 is sort of talking about the different kinds of open source software versus other kinds of software. So is it open source or traditionally proprietary or quote unquote closed source software? And we'll learn about that. We'll talk about, that's what bullet 2 is about. Bullet 3 talks a lot about these different business models. That's really the core of business practices, is understanding different models of leveraging open source software as part of your business. Again, maybe you're using open source software just as libraries, or maybe you're using it as just tools, or maybe you want to do something more like use it as part of your platform. You've got a web platform, a cloud platform, and you want to use some open source software tools or some open source software infrastructure. How does that fit into your business practice? Maybe you want to go the extra step and you have existing software that you want to release as open source software, or you want to make it as part of an open source software community so that you can get other people interested in developing the software with you and becoming co-developers. That's what some of the topics that we'll talk about in this course as well. And that's really what we're talking about in number 3. And of course, number 4 is we will definitely work collaboratively. You're going to find yourself working almost in an open source mode throughout the course. So you're going to be learning and practicing as we go through the course. That's really what number 4 there is talking about. The second micro course is establishing an open source program office. And so just to kind of highlight some of the things that are going on in this, sort of the outcomes of the open source program office course, you're going to be able to assess your organization's preparedness to be involved in open source software. And there's different levels of preparedness, and you need to approach it from different angles. And we'll talk about some of those risk points and how to evaluate that risk. Again, you're going to work collaboratively throughout this that micro course. You're going to be again almost emulating an open source software project in the way that we're going to communicate and collaborate with each other. And at the end, you will be able to develop an implementation plan that will identify and address any gaps that you find about adopting open source software. So let's focus on the open source business practices micro course first. So it's 4 weeks. And so this is what you're getting in each of the 4 weeks. So the first week is really about open source software and how it's used in business. So some of the discussion topics, and these are actually taken from the course notes. So what is open source software is one of the things that we're going to start with. So if you are coming to this without much experience in open source software, this first week is intended to be a very quick ramp up. So you're going to come back with some, as I mentioned, some project time outside of the micro courses. So every week that we meet, we're going to have those discussions, and that's what's in the darker green. And then you're going to have some takeaway assignments where you're going to do deeper dives and talk about these topics. And so in that first week, after we're done with our discussion around open source software and how it's used in business, you're going to go back and do a deep dive and compare these different license models. In week 2, again, we'll start that discussion by kind of reporting out the things that you learned in week 1, especially in your outside work. But we're going to then talk about how do you leverage that open source software. So how do you apply it in your organization? And for the outside work and the small group work, you're going to go back and do a deep dive looking at case studies of several of those points. And then in week 3, we'll come back, and again, we'll start the conversation by having those groups report out, but we're going to talk about the open source software archetypes, right? The different archetypes are basically the standard models of open source software. And so the deep dive that you're going to do after that week 3 is you're going to do and discuss the organizational investment in open source software. In week 4, we're going to come back and talk about open source business practices, right? That's the title of the course, but that's what we're talking about here. We're kind of bringing it all together. So now everything that we talked about in weeks 1, 2, and 3 is now coming together in that final week. And that's where we're able to wrap it up and understand how do we now put all this together, all the pieces together of the puzzle to build a business on open source software. So looking at the other micro course, establishing an open source program office. And so again, let's kind of look at the breakdown. How is this being broken down? So what are we talking about week by week? So the first week, we're really talking about what is an open source program office, right? You probably heard it referred to as an OSPO in some places, right? Open source program office, OSPO. You're going to have a deep dive that you're going to do after that. So between weeks 1 and 2, you're going to go back and do a deep dive and talk about commoditization cycle in your niche, and be able to come back and talk about that at the beginning of week 2. And so again, as we meet again in week 2, we're going to have that report out from those small groups. And then we're going to talk about organizational readiness, organizational policy. So how ready is an organization? How can you talk about that maturity model? What policies need to be in place? What processes need to be in place? And then the deep dive you're going to do between weeks 2 and 3, you're going to go out and you're going to talk about what does your open source readiness look like? And also talking about climbing that readiness ladder. Where are we on the readiness ladder? What do we need to do to get from where we are to the next step in terms of maturity? In week 3, you'll do a report out on that. And then we're going to talk about how do you engage in these open source software communities, especially related to an open source program office. And so we're going to talk about strategies in terms of addressing open source software. And then, and we have some discussion points around that. And then we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to ask you to do a deep dive after that on your organization's investment in open source software.